There's a huge array of tubeless tyre sealants on the market these days, all claiming to prevent punctures better than all the others. So we decided to test 6 of the most interesting ones to try and find out which one really does work the best. We decided to test Finish Line's brand new tubeless tyre sealant, Etherteens tyre plasma, Stands No Tube's race sealant, Orange Seal's endurance sealant, Effetto Mariposa Caffey Latex, and Schwalbe Dock Blue. Obviously there are a lot of other tubeless sealants on the market, but a lot of them, such as Joe's tyre sealant and PT's tyre sealant, we've already tested in the past and found them to be not quite as good as some of the best on the market. So while we couldn't test every sealant out there on the market, we've tested a lot of sealants in the past and we have a pretty good idea of what's likely to work well. Last year I did a similar group test of 6 slightly different tubeless sealants, and you can find a link to the article on that in the video description. So for those who don't know, tubeless sealant is some kind of liquid. It can either be water-based or latex-based, which sits inside the tyre, and the idea being that when you get a puncture, a hole in the sidewall or the tread of the tyre, the liquid will find that hole, and as it escapes, it will plug that hole and hopefully stop you losing too much air pressure, such that it can, in theory, plug a puncture before you even notice you've got one. The test process was very simple in order to test each sealant in exactly the same way. First of all, I measured out 100 milliliters of the sealant and put it inside the tyre, then inflated the tyre on the same rim to 30 psi. The next thing was to shake up the sealant and give it a good spin inside the wheel in order that the sealant was evenly coated around the tyre's circumference. I then took a pick, which is about 2 millimeters in diameter, and stabbed the tyre in between the treads on the very outside of the tyre and gave it a good spin. I then measured how much air had escaped from the tyre and pumped it back up to 30 psi. I then did the exact same thing with a 4 millimeter screwdriver, pushing that into the same hole, spinning the tyre and measuring how much air had escaped, pumping it back up to 30 psi. Then I repeated with a 6mm screwdriver, and then for the tyres that were able to hold air after being stabbed by a 6mm screwdriver, I then repeated with an 8mm screwdriver. For the 650B by 2.3 inch tyre that we were using, some manufacturers would recommend using very slightly more than 100 milliliters, some very slightly less. It's all a bit vague, so we decided to stick with 100 milliliters for each sealant so it was nice and consistent. In an ideal world, I would have liked to use a brand new identical tyre for each sealant, but that's kind of impractical and completely wasteful. So I found 2 identical tyres, so that's 3 sealants for each tyre. And in between each test, I completely cleaned and washed out the tyre and then taped over any holes that were still leaking and just used a different section of the tyre for each sealant. So we can be pretty confident that the order in which the sealants were tested shouldn't affect the results. So based on this testing, this is what I thought of these 6 sealants in ascending order of overall rating. First up is Finish Line's tubeless sealant, which is the only product here which isn't latex based. Instead, it uses propylene glycol as a base with Kevlar particles in it. So while the other sealants use latex, which kind of coagulates and actually polymerizes as it escapes the tyre and forms a sort of a seal, this type of sealant uses a range of particles and fibers to mechanically plug the hole. The advantage of this is that it lasts longer. It won't react with the air that you pump in and out of the valve as you use the tyre. So it won't solidify and form that layer of stuck-on latex around the outside of the tyre. In fact, Finish Line say it should last the lifetime of the tyre. We've only had this product on test for a couple of weeks, so we can't really say too much to how long it will last, but it should last longer than latex sealants and won't form that horrible goopy mess. It's also completely non-toxic and very easy to wash out of the tyre with water. It's much easier to clean up. However, in our tests we found that it just didn't plug holes as well as the others. We found that the sealant was so kind of thick and viscous that it struggled to coat the outside of the tyre, which made it a little bit harder to seat the tyre on the rim in the first place than with all the other sealants. And this is also something we found with other non-latex based sealants. Basically, in order to plug the holes mechanically, they have to be so viscous and thick that it's really hard to get a good coating around the outside of the tyre, and they often lose air when you're trying to inflate them, or even lose air overnight after you've inflated the tyre. Whilst it sealed 2 and 4 mil holes absolutely fine, once we got to the 6 mil screwdriver, it couldn't seal properly and wouldn't hold more than 20 psi after that hole had been made. And in this regard, all the other latex-based sealants outperformed it. All of those could hold at least 20 psi comfortably after being stabbed with the 6 mil screwdriver. The other thing we don't like about it is that it's really quite expensive. For this 240 ml bottle, it's £15 in the UK, and for a litre, it'll cost you 40 quid. So it's one of the most expensive sealants here. Schwalbe's Dock Blue is actually made by Stan's. In fact, in our test, it performs almost identically to Stan's regular sealant, not the race sealant, and that's probably because it's the same stuff. As far as we can tell, the only difference is that it's dyed blue, and you get a handy little 60 milliliter bottle and piece of pipe to apply sealant through the valve into your tyre, which is nice to have. So just like Stan's regular sealant, which we tested last year, it performs really well, especially with smaller holes, sealing them very quickly with minimal loss of air. However, once we got up to the 6 mil screwdriver, it had more loss of air than with the other sealants here, particularly the ones which use more kind of fine particles in with the latex mix. So it's not the best performer, especially with the larger punctures. And while it performs well, we think it performs no better than Stan's regular sealant, and it costs more. It's £20 for this 500 ml bottle, whereas Stan's will cost you £16 for a 473 ml bottle, which works out a fair bit cheaper. So you're paying quite a premium for that little applicator bottle, which can be handy, but is not really worth paying that much for, I think. Next up is Etherteens Tyre Plasma. This is another latex-based sealant, which uses quite a lot of larger particles inside the solution. That means that you need to really shake it vigorously before you use it and pour it straight away after shaking, otherwise those particles will settle to the bottom. So that's really important. We found it performs really well. Even with the 6 mil screwdriver, it plugged that hole really quickly and held air pressure. However, even with the smaller holes, with all of the holes that we made, we noticed that it does just leak very slightly. It plugs the hole quickly, but not completely. So there's a little bit of leaking that you can just hear, like a very slow puncture. Even with just a 2 mil pick, it didn't completely form an airtight seal. So we think that if you get punctures with this sealant, it will plug those holes really nicely, very quickly, but it won't completely seal the tyre, and you may have a slow puncture. At £20 for a 1 litre bottle, it's one of the cheapest sealants here, and it does plug holes really nicely, but because of that slow leaking we noticed, we can't recommend it above the top performing sealants here. Next up is Orange Seal's Endurance Sealant. Now, Orange Seal make 2 variations of their sealant. They do the regular and the endurance version. Last year we tested the regular version and found that it was one of the best at sealing large punctures, but it does dry up really quickly. You're going to need to top it up more regularly than most sealants. So this year we decided to test the endurance sealant, as it's claimed to last longer and be a bit more of a practical everyman choice. Orange Seal claim that this will last up to 4 months, but again, we haven't had time to test it for that long. Although it didn't perform quite as well in our tests as the original version, it's still one of the best here in terms of sealing large punctures. It dealt with the smaller holes absolutely fine, and the 6 mil screwdriver, it did plug that hole really quickly. However, once we started pumping it back up towards 30 psi, the seal broke and it lost a lot of air pressure. So it wouldn't get up to 30 psi after being stabbed with the 6 mil screwdriver, which the top 2 performing sealants could. It's also one of the most expensive sealants here at £16 for this 237 ml bottle, although it does come with a handy injector. And even if you buy a refill bottle, it's £40 for 910 ml, which makes it one of the most expensive sealants here. Next up is Effetto Mariposa Caffey Latex, which, as the name suggests, is another latex-based sealant, which we find to be one of the most effective here. It plugged the holes made by the smaller implements really very quickly, with almost no measurable loss of air. When we got to the 6mm screwdriver, it did take a couple of revolutions to seal and lost a bit of air, but when we pumped it back up to 30 psi, it held absolutely fine. Because it was able to hold 30 psi after the 6mm screwdriver, we tried it with an 8mm screwdriver, but it wasn't really able to hold more than a few PSI after that. So based on these tests, there was only one sealant that was able to outperform Caffey Latex, but it is one of the cheapest sealants here at 20 quid for a 1 litre bottle. That brings us neatly on to Stan's race sealant, which we found to be the most effective sealant in this test under these conditions. It plugged all of the smaller holes absolutely fine with minimal loss of pressure. The hole made by the 6mm screwdriver was sealed with only a 5 psi loss of pressure, and it held 30 psi absolutely no problem. When we got to the 8mm screwdriver, it did take a wee while to seal. It took about 3 revolutions before it formed a seal, but then it was able to hold 20 psi before that seal was broken again. So in that sense, it outperforms all the other sealants here, including Caffey Latex. According to Stan's, the main difference between the race sealant and the regular sealant is the number of particles that are suspended inside the latex mix. They say there are about twice as many of the larger sealing particles. That should mean that it seals larger holes better, but it may not last as long. They still claim that it will last up to 6 months inside the tyre, but again, the longevity is outside of the scope of this test. However, at £32 for a 946ml bottle, it is considerably more expensive than Caffey Latex. So whilst I would recommend Stan's race sealant for, as the name suggests, racing if you care most about just avoiding punctures at all costs. However, if you're more concerned with cost, then Caffey Latex is probably the one I would go for. Also, whilst we haven't had time to test them over a kind of 6-month period or longer, I would conjecture that Caffey Latex is likely to last longer before it clogs up than Stan's race sealant. So effectively, we've got 2 winners in this test, depending on your budget and what you want from your sealant. So bear in mind that this is a lab test rather than a real world test, because there's just no way that you could get the consistency you need to test fairly in the real world. But there may be certain aspects of real world testing that don't translate into this test and vice versa. If I was going to go racing tomorrow, I would definitely use Stan's race sealant. However, if I was going to be spending my own money on a sealant for everyday use, I would probably go for Caffey Latex. But what do you think? Does your real world experience agree with what we've found in these lab tests? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.